Over to you, Julia.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Fiona, and welcome to everyone. And thanks for joining this talk. And hopefully you'll now see me at the top right-hand corner and hear me, but you'll be seeing a blank screen. But this is where any talk like this begins, a blank screen or blank sheet of paper or a black hole. But I've got lots that I want to talk about, lots of pictures to share. So, are you sitting comfortably? Well, let's begin with the title, Wildflowers, Meadows and Gardens, Challenging Ideas for Naturalistic Gardening. And for anyone who hasn't been to garden or know where we live, there's a couple of important points really. One is we're 800 feet above sea level and often blessed with weather like this when it isn't raining. But we now get 2,200 litres of rain falling on every square metre of our land in a year, we did last year, which is an increase of about 25% over the last decade. So that's something to bear in mind as you watch the rest of the talk. Now, for most of the time that we've been gardening, I guess we like a lot of gardeners. We have a simple approach. You see a plant you like, probably growing in a pot, or you buy some bulbs, or maybe grow something from seed and grow it on. And then you look for somewhere you're going to plant it in the garden, dig a hole, put it in and watch it grow and develop. But what about our plant sources? Maybe the wonderful nurseries where a lot of us source our plants. Well, their aim is obviously to grow beautiful plants that are going to appeal to us, but they're grown in very different conditions. So they're usually grown individually in a plastic pot, in a compost mix, which will be very different to our own soil, often with some inorganic fertilizer, maybe with some pesticides or fungicides, and sometimes even grown in a polytunnel like this fabulous Primulus Sieboldi. Now, it's not a criticism, but that's just an observation on how it is. But how are these plants going to interact with other plants when we get them home and plant them in the garden? And do we think about how they're going to interact with other plants in the garden? And how does the same garden change through the seasons? And what about maintenance? What does it cost in terms of time or effort or money? Which is something that's often not available for most gardens that you read about or see. And most importantly, I think, how are our gardens, or any garden, how is it successful? Is it at becoming a diverse community, not just of plants, but of all the other invertebrates and fungi and animals that a plant-based ecosystem will naturally support? Now, probably 25 or so years ago, I started to become fascinated by the diversity of moths that we see in our upland garden. And there are huge numbers of them, but of course they're not often seen. You have to really go looking for them. And this progressed over a number of years to a more general interest in insect-friendly flowers. In other words, which flowers appeal to which insects. And the more you start looking, the more you realize that actually very few plants appeal to all insects right across the board. But this started to have a big impact on how we planted and developed the garden. And then a real light bulb moment was about 7 years ago, reading an article on ancient Romanian hay meadows. And I was struck by the fact that the children in these Romanian villages could identify and put a name to most of the flowering plants in these meadows. And you would, in a diverse meadow, you'd have perhaps 40 different species of plants growing in a single square metre, which is quite a thought. And that gave us a lot of inspiration for our own meadows, which also benefited from us starting to go and visit one or two native wildflower meadows in this country. And at that point, our 10 acres of permanent pasture really were pretty flower-free zones, like a lot of upland grazed land in our part of the world. But I had been really struck by this idea that in a hay meadow you could get these fantastically beautiful combinations of flowers and the insects and fungi and other wildlife that these communities would support. And so we started this process, and we were quite pleased, even within 5 years, to be able to produce a vase of flowers and grass stems that looked aesthetically pleasing. And then I started to think about how different one of these hay meadow communities of plants and other organisms, how different that was to a typical garden setting, and started to think about whether some of these concepts could be taken from a hay meadow and incorporated into the way that we design and manage our gardens. And the real crux of this is trying to create these sort of diverse, evolving plant communities. And so for the talk, I'm going to break it down into 3 sections: Wildflower Hay Meadows, Pictorial Meadows, and our multicultural magic meadow. So we'll kick off with Wildflower Hay Meadows. And once you start looking at these, you realize that rather like gardens, no 2 meadows are the same. So I'm going to feature one of our meadows, this fairly steep, sloping, about 1.5 acre field. Now, we had certain advantages when we started, in that all our meadows had been grazed by sheep at fairly low intensity, but we hadn't put any fertilizers or muck onto them for the previous 15 or so years. But when we started in 1993, this is what that meadow looked like. It hadn't been grazed at this point for a year. And so all the bare patches are where the rank grass had fallen over the winter and pretty much killed things. So it looked as though somebody had used weed killer on it. But an important point, which maybe is a bit of a kind of anathema to a lot of gardeners, is that most of the fantastically diverse wild flower populations around the world are often growing in extremely impoverished soil. So they never get any fertilizer or muck from animals. And in terms of European hay meadows, grazing historically has been a very important feature of how the plant populations have developed. And after the last ice age in Northern European locations, grasslands would have been grazed by herbivores, typically large things like bison or elk or oryx. Although they wouldn't have been the open expanses that now one thinks about when you think about a meadow. They'd have been much more like glades in between trees. So more shade than you would get in a typical meadow now. Now, the Welsh uplands never really got grazed very much by deer, but they've been grazed by sheep for hundreds of years. And in a lot of ways, sheep are perfect for this kind of restoration work because they can stay outside over the winter with minimal supplementation. A lot of people dispute whether sheep are good at this because sheep are actually quite selective grazers. So they will tend to nibble out a lot of the flowers in preference to the grasses, but it largely depends on the breed that you use, and more critically, the stocking density. So we saw this up in Northumberland. I've never seen this anywhere locally, but these are hillsides grazed by sheep, but absolutely covered with wildflowers. So stocking density is very critical. Now, obviously having herbivores on the grassland, nutrient gets returned from pea and poo. And also the fact that they're grazing and taking out grasses and the hooves are tending to press in seed into the ground, that's a kind of helpful thing as well. But you can use these concepts even to create a wildflower meadow on a kind of conventional area of turf in a garden. And I'll touch on that later. But as well as the pea and the poo from grazing herbivores, if your field is surrounded by either unflailed hedges or mature trees, then you get an awful lot of windblown leaf litter coming into the field every autumn. And this will take in a lot of the micronutrients that have been brought up by the tree's roots from very deep down. And then that can be recycled into the meadow plants. But this recycling process requires the action of fungi, because fungi are the only living organisms that produce the enzymes that are necessary for breaking down the cellulose and the lignin, which constitute plant cell walls. Animals can't do that. So all grazing herbivores actually rely on gut microorganisms to carry out this degradation, and then the herbivore just absorbs through the digestive system these byproducts. But it's a critical thing. The fungi have to break in the field. The fungi break down the leaves, and before they develop these specific enzymes about 350 million years ago, all this annual leaf litter that fell on the ground just accumulated, and over time that got turned into the deposits of oil and coal and natural gas that we've been taking out of the ground over the last 100 years or so. Now, one of the things which we weren't expecting when we started this process of meadow restoration was we saw all these wonderful, colourful wax-capped fungi popping up over the meadows. And one of the interesting things about these fungi is that they naturally distributed all over the world, but they've been largely eradicated by modern agricultural practice. And that's tilling the land, but also NPK fertilizers will eliminate these fungi just with one application, and then it'll take years for them ever to come back. And those are in addition to what a lot of gardeners know about, which are these little arbusco mycorrhizal fungi, which are microscopic. They never produce mushrooms. And these help most plants absorb phosphorus from the soil. But again, there's an issue with these. If you put phosphorus or nitrogen or too much onto the ground, you're going to wipe out these mycorrhizal fungi very quickly. So, of course, there's an issue. If you're growing plants in pots with inorganic fertilizers, you're probably never going to get many of these fungi establishing, which may not be an issue, but if you're trying to create a natural community, then it probably is. Wales is actually a global hotspot for, particularly West Wales, for these wax caps, which, as I explained, would have been distributed very widely, but have been largely wiped out. And in addition, Wales actually has one of the world's experts on wax caps, Gareth Griffiths, who's based at Aberystwyth University. But even after decades of trying to do this, Gareth hasn't been able to either culture wax caps in laboratory or even transfer them from one site to another. Nobody just understands what the critical factors are. But what he has discovered or reckons is that for every, what are the wax caps doing beneath the surface? And he reckons that for every kilogram of mushrooms that you see in a field, there's probably 99 kilos of fungal mycelium supporting that network and being able to push these mushrooms up. So that's a huge amount of biological activity and a huge amount of stored carbon under the soil surface. The other interesting thing he's discovered really very recently is that wax caps are high in heavy nitrogen. Now, you probably all know that there are stable isotopes of certain elements. So the classic one is carbon, and heavy carbon is used in carbon dating, which is of great benefit for kind of archaeology. Well, there are two stable nitrogen isotopes, and the heavy one, nitrogen 15, tends to accumulate in protein. And so Gareth has discovered that wax caps have really high levels of heavy nitrogen. And I'm including this slide of a marine ecosystem to illustrate that at kind of every step up the food chain, you tend to get about another 3 or 4 parts per thousand of heavy nitrogen. So starting at the bottom with the plant plankton, you have maybe 5 to 7 parts per thousand. By the time you get up to a killer whale, you're up to 18 to 20 parts per thousand. So any vegans in the audience will have much lower levels of heavy nitrogen than anyone who eats a lot of meat. But if you have a look at where waxcaps score on this with a heavy nitrogen level of about 15, and then compare it with plants or soil or these other mushrooms to the right, the saprotrophs, waxcaps are really high in heavy nitrogen. And nobody really knows why this is, but the kind of implication from other ecosystems is that waxcaps in some way are involved in processing animal material, whether that's earthworms or invertebrate larvae beneath the soil surface. Now, this is about scientific as I'm getting, but I'm really putting this in to make the point that as a species, we've been brilliant at creating Zoom and things like that, connecting people, but we've destroyed these organisms which were very widespread, and we really have no idea exactly what role they are playing in our soils in meadows. But they would be the role of fungi in soils in gardens is really important, and I think we just don't have very much awareness of what's going on there. And a final point on this is permanent pasture, partly because of these fungal populations. It's actually now known that permanent pasture stores more carbon in its soil than any other form of land use. Certainly not any agricultural or tilled land, which is very low in stored soil carbon, but it's even more stored soil carbon than in forestry, which is an interesting thing to mull over. So, starting with no flowers in our meadows, how did we actually get to where we are now? Well, like most people, we started by introducing what's called a hemiparasitic plant, and the one that everyone reaches for is something called yellow rattle. Now, this will grow on its own, but it also parasitizes the roots of particularly grasses, but certain other plants as well. And so it tends to weaken the vigor of the grasses and thereby allow other flowers a better chance to grow. And yellow rattle's an annual plant, so it germinates from seed, which has to fall to the ground. It needs a chill over the winter, and then it germinates early in spring, and it'll grow really quickly. So from seedlings to setting mature seed can happen in 3-4 months. So the seedlings are very small things that you start to notice usually March, early April. And the other thing to mention about yellow rattle is the flowers are actually great nectar sources for bumblebees and honeybees. And if also from a gardening point of view, rather like the Chelsea chop, if you cut them early, early enough, they will actually regenerate and flower later in the year. And starting from nothing, most people's experience with yellow rattle is once you've got it in a field, within just a few years, you will be getting millions of seed, kilograms of seed produced. It's an extremely efficient plant. But there's another hemiparasitic plant that we also introduced and almost like even more, partly because it's not yellow, it's pink, but also it flowers earlier, so lousewort. And again, this weakens other plants, but it flowers probably 6 weeks earlier than yellow rattle. And a final hemiparasitic plant, which is eyebright, which flowers quite a bit later than yellow rattle, and it's a much smaller flower, doesn't seem to have quite the same appeal to insects. But again, this is all adding interest, aesthetic interest, but more importantly, it's weakening grasses, so allowing lots of other flowers the opportunity to survive amongst the grasses. And the way we got all of these going was very simply collecting some seed locally and scattering it in the meadow. And then every year we would do the same thing, collect seed from the plants that had grown. And sometimes now we have a little bit of help doing this with the grandchildren, because a yellow rattle in the seed are quite a kind of tactile plant to handle. But who's ever heard of using hemiparasites in gardens? I mean, there's loads of species of Pedicularis, which is the lousewort genus, but nobody seems to have tried using those in gardens, and I'm not quite sure why that is. But as well as those, what I would call plant break species, which are existing in a meadow ecosystem, there are plant boost species like the clovers, red and white clover and bird's foot trefoil and certain vetches, which will fix nitrogen. So they're kind of sucking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it to a form that's accessible to the other plants. Now, a key part of managing a hay meadow is that you want the grass really short, whether through grazing or other means early in the year. And if you're doing this at home on a patch of lawn, say, and you don't even have rabbits as grazing animals, then you can mirror these sort of changes using strimmers or mechanical cutters. But the important point again is you've got to remember you're trying to weaken the fertility or reduce the fertility of the soil. So you really need to remove the clippings. You don't want to be using a mulch mower or anything like that. So in our limited scale, this is obviously not commercial, but how do we get the hay off our fields? Well, we acquired this two-wheeled power scythe, which is Italian made, and we do the cutting with that. You've then got an issue if you want to use the hay, which we do, of how do you store it? And this is the great late Dave Bevan's solution, was to make a manual baler, which will turn out a small bale in about 4 minutes. Or you can invest in mechanical baling equipment, but it's sometimes quite difficult to justify the capital cost of doing this on a small scale. And it's often difficult to get a contractor in to just cope with small areas of grass. So in the end, with the manual baling, we actually, after a couple of years, we decided it was just an extra step of work. So there's a lot of manual work in making hay this way, an awful lot of manual turning, but you tend to do it in nice weather. And then what we do is we rake the dried hay up into big bags, which are quite easy to move around. And the other thing you have to do is, when you're taking hay off in a staggered way like this, you can't do this sort of manual work with just 2 people and expect to clear the whole field. So we would maybe do 25 passes a day, and then if the forecast is still good, which it rarely is, then you maybe cut a bit more. And the hay gets tipped out of the big bags into special hay sheds where it can dry a little bit more, and we just store it loose and feed it direct from the hay shed. So all the years we've been doing it, in spite of very, very iffy weather, we actually, so far, we haven't lost any doing it that way. And every year we get increasing diversity and we get a reducing crop, which is obviously not what a commercial farmer would necessarily want, but we get a more diverse mix in the field. Now, you can buy commercial seed for doing this, but there definitely are stories of it not working terribly well, and sometimes it's not as fresh as it should be. So I think if you can get hold of local seed, if you wanted to do this on a small or a large scale, that's worth trying to do. Or alternatively, probably even better, get some green hay. And what that involves or means is, in our case, we would cut a section of grass and just let it wilt for an hour or two, and then collect it up. It's obviously much heavier then, but collect it into one of these big bags, and then you can transfer that. And we've done it with our own fields and with some other people. You can transfer that to the new field, the receiving field, and spread it around as soon as you can, and then the seeds will fall out, and that can work very well. Some people will suggest you need to scarify the ground before sowing, but we've never found that, and most people we know locally haven't found that necessary. They get good results just with the scattering the seed in the way that I've mentioned. Another option, if you want to kind of speed up or reduce fertility a little bit faster, if you are using grazing animals, is obviously you can collect some of the dung, which again is a tedious job, but you've always got it to use on your veg patch. And what we tend to notice, which is most people's experience, is that changes happen gradually, but you see certain things different every year. And so you need a bit of patience. It's rather like planting a copse or some trees. You don't get instant results, but it's very satisfying. And if anyone's interested in more information, a couple of websites I'll mention. Firstly, the Coronation Meadows website, which will give you information on local meadows. And then also a plug for the local Carmarthenshire Meadows group. There's a website there which has got lots of really useful links and interesting information. You might even decide it's worth joining if you live locally. And I bought this book 2 or 3 years ago, Wildflower Wonders of the World by Bob Gibbons. And there are some fantastic vistas in here. But interestingly, only 2 locations, the Burren in Ireland and the Maca in the Hebrides, which get a mention in this part of the world, which is strange. And the idea of people getting on a plane to travel to the other side of the world to look at wildflowers in a natural system seems a bit of anathema the way we're going. So I think there are lots of opportunities for seeing spectacular meadows locally. You just need to find them out, and it's well worth going and looking at them. And if you have a kind of gardening hat, which I do, there's even scope for greater diversity. So you can introduce other plants into a meadow. We tried snake's head fritillaries, which are a kind of native plant. I don't know whether they're going to work. And also we've tried camasias. Obviously, if you're doing anything like this, you need to be certain that if you're using the hay for feeding, either they're non-toxic, or if they are toxic, that they've completely died down before you take the hay off. And a final point to make really is don't panic if the prolific seeders like yellow rattle seem to be taking over, which they almost certainly will, because that's most people's experience. But I think a big factor, and we'll mention this later on with gardens, as to how quickly plants will establish comes down to slugs, because slugs will take out lots of plants at the seedling form. And we were very lucky in 2018, we had freeze drying spring followed by a very hot dry summer, which knocked our meadow slug population to literally less than 5% of what it was before. So that's a big help. And a final point is, if you cut it for the hay, or cut it if you're doing it mechanically and remove it, then you need to aftermath graze. And the timing that you do that, maybe if you do it quite late on, it gives any seedlings a better chance to establish. So the kind of summary, wildflower meadows, hay meadows, have had centuries to evolve the particular mix of plants that you find in them, and then the supporting fungi and invertebrates as well. And once you start observing these meadows, you see that they're fantastically well integrated. So often just as one plant is finishing, another one will take over, and then another and another. And they're real integrated webs of life that work fantastically well with just a little bit of human and animal intervention. So I thought I'd quickly whiz through just to show you what our hay meadow looks like. And we'll very quickly whiz through to give you an indication of how it changes. And you'll see that flowers really only start to appear kind of April. And those are the added in fritillaries. And then late April, things are a bit later this year, early May, suddenly things start to grow. If you get a little bit of rain, a little bit of warmth. Things get really exciting in June if you find orchids are coming in, and your yellow rattle buttercups. And that just illustrates a turning machine, mechanical turner that will fit on the front of that little power scythe. But it's not brilliant under all conditions, so we still do a lot of manual turning. And we find, a lot more birds are coming into the meadows now, and the odd rabbit, or more than the odd rabbit. And then very often it's really kind of end of July. And ideally, if you were able to, you would wait until August or September before you cut this. But to do that, you would have to have some kind of completely mechanized system. Equally, doing it the way that we do it, doing it in bits and pieces, it means that we're still getting lots of flowers in the meadow into August and September. So from the point of view of invertebrates and things like grasshoppers, that's actually a big plus. It's not all getting taken out in one go. Knapweed flowers quite late. So again, that really has to be on peripheries, or you have to cut around it. In September, things are winding down, but you're still getting goldfinches coming in, and it's really then that you start to see the fungi, although as you're cutting the hay in even July, you're finding waxcap fungi. So these are adding colour and interest right through to the end of the year pretty much. And obviously you'll gather from what I said that these have just appeared. We had no control over them at all. So right into December pretty much you'll get waxcaps. Right, second section. Now this is cut down Pictorial Meadows. I was going to talk about these briefly, and these have become quite a popular concept, and but have maybe muddied in the general public's mind what a meadow is. So they usually consist of a bought mix of annual seed that are sown into a prepared seed bed. And often they'll do quite well in poor conditions. So in that regard, they're similar maybe to hay meadows. And a lot of the work on these has been done by scientists at Sheffield University, in particular James HITCHMOUGH and Nigel Dunnett. And HITCHMOUGH's done produced a wonderful book, which is a summary of 20 or 30 years research on this. Or you can look at the Pictorial Meadows website. And this is a company that's been set up by these two chaps with others to develop and profit from the concept. And if you have a look on the website, they do all sorts of mixes. They don't actually tell you which species are in a lot of these. And if you do the sums, it's quite an expensive way to go. There's also ongoing research at the National Botanic Gardens with Lucy Witter and Laura Jones. And probably a lot of you will have seen at Aberglasney, they have an example of an annual meadow as well. The big problem with them, well, a couple of big problems with them as far as I can see, is there's a lot of bare soil in them. And so you've got a lot of potential for weeds getting in there. And there's a long bare fallow period where there's no aesthetic interest, but also from the point of view of carbon storage in the soil, it's not really terribly good. And it's extremely difficult because the seed has to be sown every spring into a prepared seed bed. It's really quite difficult to work spring bulbs in with this kind of concept of annual seed sowing. And actually, as we'll see later, spring bulbs, crocuses particularly, maybe snowdrops are really invaluable early season nectar sources for lots of our insects. But there's also this, as I mentioned, this ongoing potential weed issue, and also the labour side of it and the seed costs that you're going to have to keep doing this every year, which of course is great from the company's point of view if you keep buying their seed. And a final point is the mixes vary, but a lot of them have quite a lot of umbellifers in, which are pretty good for hoverflies and butterflies, but not so good for quite a lot of our bees. So as an example, contrast this scene from Aberglasney in December with the minimal bare soil that you get in a winter hay meadow, even if you look down closely, and there's a whole topic for discussion in what's going on there, what the sheep are eating. With examples of winter ground cover in various areas of our garden. So bare soil is a kind of complete anathema to us, and we never use organic mulches. We would much rather cover the ground, whether it's in shade or out in the sun with plants, even if it's moss. So this is a kind of meadow-like perennial ground cover in sunshine, even in winter. And this is what I'm going to move on to talk about now. What I now call, it's changed over the years, but I now call our multicultural terrace meadow garden, which really now functions in a lot of ways like a hay meadow, in that most of the plants in it are perennials. There's really quite limited input in that it gets cut and removed in November, but gives us now, as you'll see, aesthetic interest and interest for lots of other organisms and flowers from pretty much end of January right the way through to the end of October. So actually does much better than a hay meadow in this regard. So I'm going to try and talk about the journey to here, which is what it looks like. I guess that's the end of May. From here, which is where we started off. When we bought the property in August 1993, it was derelict. And so the first thing we had to do, because it was terribly damp inside, is get Ron with a digger to dig the shale out from the back of the house where it was piled up, and to allow the structure to dry out. And the only logical place that he could put it was to push it round to the front of the house. So that's the shale, which, so this didn't look terribly promising in spring 1994. It didn't look a lot better in 1995 either, although the house was now improving somewhat. But things got even worse when we had to renovate the long old cow parlour, which involved smashing up concrete, and then with some willing or child exploited labour, digging out the shale beneath the concrete, and all of this got pushed out on top of the bank from the back. So that was it in spring 1996. So very free draining, but you can appreciate almost no soil there at all. And we had a big pile of leftover gravel from the building work. So inspired by Beth Chatto's dry gravel garden, I thought we'd make a wet gravel garden, because I really didn't want to come down at weekends and holidays, which is how we occupied the place for the first 13 years, and mow grass. So I thought probably very rashly, I thought a gravel garden would be a nice alternative. So as I mentioned, it's free draining but nutrient poor, and you can see we started off at the bottom here by planting scraps of really common cheap plants like bugle and mossy saxifrage, New Zealand burr, marjoram, and tiny scraps, and just mulching with gravel between them. Then we, halfway along, after we'd done some initial planting, we discovered we had some big slabs in one of the cow sheds. So again, with the willing helpers, old-fashioned style, we had to move those around the back of the house rather than the direct route. So it was developing a little bit in this scene, but we had minimal on-site compost. We did have an old Dutch barn with guano, which we saw some compost from. But by spring 1997, it was looking maybe a little bit more like a garden. So, but you can see things were planted in distinct blocks. And we also collected seed from certain plants like Tormentil and Self-Heal, which we could see were quite tough. They would survive rabbit and slug predation and minimal maintenance. So those got incorporated as well. Go on another 5 years, and it's looking much more appealing then, but still very definitely distinct blocks of planting. And then once we started to open for the National Garden Scheme in 2010, and got comments that there weren't very many flowers in the garden in March, we thought, well, let's start adding some spring bulbs into this to extend the flowering season. We started off with crocuses, and then gradually we experimented with other natives. So most of the flowers that you can see there are native plants: sea campion, germander speedwell, and bit of etchling. And then the really exciting thing was a lot of the plants we'd started with originally, like the bugle and the mossy saxifrage and New Zealand burr, all started to spread across the ground and merge, and really functioned a bit like grass would in a hay meadow, in that they, and I think actually moss, it comes into this category as well, in that they would cover the bare ground and increasingly suppress weed germination. And then the other plants that were taller and later flowering, later growing, could grow through this base layer and still succeed very successfully. And then by now I'd got interested in the concept of meadow ecosystems. So I started to incorporate some nitrogen fixers, because we put no muck or fertilizer onto this area or any of the garden except wood ash from the stoves and dried seaweed occasionally. So we incorporated nitrogen fixers like bird's foot trefoil. And then much more recently, I've even started to incorporate hemiparasites like eyebright, which has succeeded, although there's no grass there. And I might try lousewood. I probably won't try yellow rattle, partly because it's got yellow flowers, which I'm not keen on later in the year, but also it maybe would just be a bit too vigorous. But I still look at this conceptually and see if there are flower-free windows at any time of the year, and you can plug those if you find the right plant. So this is a very early flowering crocus, Seabury firefly, which flowers in January, so that went in. We don't have much luck with alliums, but this allium looks promising. It's one called Purple Rain. It's absolutely brilliant bee flower and looks stunning as well, and it looks like it's going to survive, which a lot of bulbs don't. Nautia macedonica, which again is a great insect friend. That's the dabs of deep burgundy there, really. And these you can collect the seed and grow on in pots, so you have little plug plants which you can then plant out. Knapweed, which again is a brilliant native, which we're now incorporating into this area. And we're even trying melancholy thistle, which again is a stunning, it's almost allium-like, but it is a thistle and very attractive to insects. Very easily taken out by slugs at the seedling stage, unfortunately. And then later in the year, Stachys officinalis in the foreground and Sidalcias, adding in more of those. And again, you can save your seed and propagate these quite easily and add them in. And the really exciting thing with doing all of this over time is signs of these naturalistic communities developing. So we've even got conical wax caps coming in this area, and orchid leaves, which first appeared in 2019, and then orchid flowers. And now we've got lots of these orchids in this area as well. There's still a little bit of hand weeding that's necessary. So you have to be able to visually look at a scene like that and spot quickly where are the weeds, and there's only a couple of weeds in there that I would remove. And typically you get the odd fine grass and maybe the odd dandelion and possibly the odd willow herb, but given the size of the area now, it really is minimal, the amount of weeding that we have to spend on it. And even when it gets cut back completely at the end of November, if you look down at it, it's actually still quite interesting. And given the comparison with a pictorial meadow or a hay meadow, there's actually a lot more visual interest in that. So there's great scope with this kind of a concept for season-long aesthetic interest, but also supporting other forms of wildlife. So I'm just going to run through some of these. So fungi, white spindles that are coming, spiders, of course, flies, that's the biggest fly species in the UK, I think, which parasitizes moth larvae. Bumblebees, and then you maybe notice that tiny ichneumon wasp beneath the flower on knapweed. Bees, of course, of all sorts, lizards, moths, butterflies, elephant hawk moth caterpillar, birds, which will come in, of course, and even rabbits come into this area from time to time. So the same idea, just to quickly give you an idea of how this meadow, multicultural meadow area, terrace meadow area changes through the year from January. So February, really the flowers kick off in February. And most of these are perennial. And the really good ones, as we'll touch on in very shortly, what you really want is flowers that are vigorous, obviously look aesthetic, and one follows on from the other. The narcissus there is one called Topolino. But all of these things so far actually set seed as well. So you get, instead of getting weeds dropping into the area, you're now starting to get plants that you actually like, flowers that you like. Sadly, that doesn't apply to most, or a lot of narcissi, that doesn't apply, and it doesn't apply to the tulips. This is all one form of tulip, which is pretty much the only tulip that we plant that's called Flaming Purissima. So you get white and pink and streakiness. And this is the last narcissus that will flower right to the end of May in a cold year. And now you can see the height is gradually starting to increase. The very tall things are Nectaroscordums. Blue flowers there are Camasias. Lots of natives. There are the alliums, London Pride in the foreground, and then we get a wave of Aquilegias coming in May, which continue into June. Those are the very tall Nectariscordums, which again are fantastic for lots of bumblebees and bees. And it becomes a bit more grass-like, almost prairie-like then in June, July, and Sidalcias will flare, and the New Zealand burr is then colouring up the seed heads, and the oregano, lots of oregano marjoram, which of course are great insect flowers, into August with the stachys. Oregano and marjoram are brilliant long season flowers actually, and you get a lot of, again, if you let them seed, you get a lot of colour variations from pinks and purples. And then in the distance there you can see, heading towards the end of August, September, asters, which will give you flower interest depending on the year, right through October. And finally it all gets cut off like a hay meadow and removed in November. So to finish off, this idea of more naturalistic gardening, what's it all about? What are some key points, some ideas you can take away with? Because we really use it, try and use it throughout the garden now in different areas. Firstly, as you can see, I don't think soil fertility is all that important. Indeed, if you were starting that kind of a garden and you had quite rich soil, I think probably, as HITCHMOUGH would say, it's really helpful to put on something like a gravel mulch initially, because that will reduce the burden of weeding. The next key thing is using this concept of layered plants, both in terms of time and space. So you've got to start with, or it really help to start with ground hugging perennials, cheap ones that will spread and get over this issue of bare soil, and don't keep putting on mulches, I would say, in this type of gardening, because you're going to suppress good seedling development. And then think about adding in bulbs, and except if you're going to add it, if you're going to use tulips in this part of the world, they are a luxury, they're not perennial. This particular tulip, some of them will survive for 3 years, but we have to add in some every year. But we do that because it just gives us a month, 3 weeks to a month of these kind of lovely effects. But the narcissi we use, you've got to be careful with which ones, but the narcissi we use are quite reliable. But ideally choose varieties which set seed. Those are all Crocus thomasina seed capsules which I collect, and 50, 60 seeds per capsule, and rather like in a meadow, you can just scatter those wherever and you will get lots of crocuses. Those are Narcissus topolino, same thing, you can collect the seed and scatter them. And then obviously you need to be able to identify the favoured seedlings, bulb seedlings, but you get your eye in if you're doing this over time. The next thing, add in insect-friendly flowers for pollinators for the rest of the year, because that will A, support them, but also probably the most important slide in the whole talk, this kind of virtuous symbiotic circle of life that I think gardeners historically don't give enough time to, that if you're growing the right sort of plants that you like, and they're fertile ones, you get more pollinators, give you more seed, which will give you more plants and more flowers. That's a really important point. And one of the things that we noticed with developing the garden, initially we saw very few bumblebees around, because if you look in the Welsh uplands, there are very few flowers early on. And we were adding in lots of insect-friendly flowers, so we're getting lots of bumblebees. But what about honeybees? And I'm just going to divert very briefly on this, because as some will know, this has become a big interest to my story with honeybees. So May 2010, I chainsawed out some sycamore logs and bought an expensive vial of pheromone and tried to attract honeybees into this. And I got really excited because I had half a dozen scout bees appear, and they checked it out and rejected it completely. So I was very deflated and gave up for a couple of years. And then a local beekeeper put a hive on site, which survived over the winter, and then it got wiped out by the severe cold spring of 2013. So he put another one on in 2014, and the bees were so aggressive, I had to ask him to remove it. So we then had a gap until Tony, who I think might be with us tonight, very kindly put a hive on site in 2018. And by luck, I'd set up this camera. So this shows this hive producing a swarm right at the end of April in 2019. And at that point, the only thing I could put them into was an old German butter churn, which I was working towards making into a suitable space for a bee colony. And those bees have been in there for the last 2 years with quite a lot of observation from me, external, but no intervention at all. Never been in there, got no idea what's going inside, but they're doing quite nicely 2 years later. And then a really key moment, as far as I was concerned on bees, was the publication of this book in 2019 by Thomas Seeley, The Untold Lives of Bees, The Untold Story of the Honeybee in the Wild. And this is a summary of 40 years research by Seeley, who's a professor at Cornell, into honeybees and how they survive in the wild. And on the basis of that, I built 4 boxes that satisfied the criteria that Seeley has worked out honeybees are looking for in a potential new home. And they all had swarms come into them last year, and I was really lucky to be able to actually witness 3 of the swarms as they came in. So this little clip, if I can get it to work, this is a time lapse, and these are all scout bees checking this box out. So they're checking the size of the opening, what direction it's facing, then going inside and calculating the volume of the box. And they also are noting that there's honeybee comb in there. So those are all potential, those are 4 of the 5 critical things that bees are looking for in a new home. You might have noticed towards the end of that clip, the numbers of bees dropped. And at that point, they were all flying back to the swarm, which was probably hanging in a tree, maybe a mile to the west. And quarter of an hour later, the swarm arrived. They were guided back to this box that I built, and over the space of an hour, they all 10, 15,000 bees, they'd all made their way inside. So, and this is I'm guessing some of you will have seen this, but it's quite a phenomenal natural experience to witness. And this is the second one of the other boxes I made, which again, this was about 8 o'clock in the morning. This swarm had moved in. Again, I was lucky enough to see it. And finally, this was actually a Swedish butter churn that I converted. And again, I was able to witness this swarm. And if you notice the bees here, a lot of the bees are fanning with their wings, and their abdomen tips are in the air, and they're distributing a hormone chemical marker to tell bees around that this is where home now is. So I just mentioned that briefly because for a long time, I thought, no, it wasn't possible to go a kind of honeybee route without spending a lot of money. And in fact, Seeley kind of gives pointers as to how it can be done if you want to keep bees in a more minimalist intervention way. But going back to critical points about managing a garden in a naturalistic way, I think with slugs in a wet climate, you have to have, at least early on, you have to have some kind of a slug strategy. There are kind of I think there are 9 slugs in that photo. We don't get anything like that number now because for various reasons, but you have to think about how you might manage slugs. Within a garden setting, you've got to think about editing and remove thugs. So we made mistakes. We used some geraniums which were just far too vigorous and dominant. So you have to be prepared to dig things like that out. But the main thing is you have to accept that things will move around and enjoy losing control. And I think, and we were like this, gardeners are great control freaks, or can be. And we manage this now, we're stewards of it, but we don't really control it, and it'll look different every year. But that's quite nice. And you can use the same principles in shady areas. Finally, I haven't put many names of plants up on here, but we have lists on our website. If I can just bring the cursor up. So there's a whole group of insect-friendly flowers done on a monthly basis. And then there's a Gethley Icaf plant palette, which again, that's done on a fortnightly basis. So if you look at either of those pages on the website, you'll get most of the names of the things that we really enjoy using. And finally, again, a lot of you will know this, but we opened the garden for charity under the National Garden Scheme. And as luck would have it, after not being allowed to visit National Garden Scheme gardens for ages and ages, tomorrow is officially the first day we can open for quite a while. So if anybody wants to come and visit the garden, we're not sadly able to offer refreshments, I don't think, for another few days, but we will be able to. But you're very welcome to come and have a look around. You never know what you might see. It is appointments only. So if you have a look at the website or the our website or the National Garden Scheme website, that will give you all the kind of critical information. But that's pretty much it, I think. So thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, Julian. That was absolutely fantastic as always. I've got a whole page of notes that I probably will ignore and go looking elsewhere, but really good. So I haven't received any questions, but hopefully now that we are unmuting, people will wave and sort of say, I've got one. Is there any? Oh,
one there. Shall I answer this?
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone can unmute and we can see people again if you like to. I think we're past the critical. There's a question. I can see a question from Jake.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what proportion of native plants you're using in the gravel garden? No. And sorry, Jake. And it'll probably change from year to year. But you maybe got an idea that a lot of the background plants, if you came and measured them, actually a lot of the background plants probably are natives. And there are a lot in there that I've only given this talk once before. I've not done it as a Zoom, but I gave it physically. And a very keen gardener said, I see you growing Germander speedwell and encouraging it. And a lot of people would view Germander speedwell as a weed. And there are probably certain parts of the garden where we wouldn't want Germander speedwell. But actually, it's a really pretty blue flower, which,
it is.
You know, in its place, it'll give you that kind of fabulous blue flower interest for quite a long period of time. And for a long time, I didn't think it actually was of interest to insects. But like a lot of flowers, I think if you have enough of them, then you do find that different insects will visit. So honeybees will visit Germander speedwell. It's probably not a top priority plant, but they will do. But it's mainly aesthetically, I think it's great. And I think the thing is when you're growing lots of things together like that, rather than in isolation, all of them, and in poor conditions probably, but all of them tend to be weakened. So there is this concept which we're obviously trying to major on, that rather like a hay meadow, they're becoming communities of plants, not just plonk plants, but you view it in isolation. So I hope that answers you.
We've got that one from Stella.
Shall I carry on with this, Elena?
Yes, do you go ahead.
So I've got a question from Stella. When and how long do you allow sheep grazing after cutting? Well, that varies a little bit depending on the year, but we're not doing the sheep economically. We're kind of using them as additional
Lawn
form
mowers.
of management. So
how long after cutting you put the sheet on, or
well,
how
that
long
will
you put
that
the
will
sheet
do.
on after cutting?
Yeah, how long afterwards, it really depends on the year. So that, for example, if we're still getting lots of flowers from areas that we cut early on, maybe May, June, we'll try, and we don't need the grass, we'll probably delay putting the sheep in until maybe the end of October, November, which is probably a lot later than a lot of people would do, because we're never clearing the whole thing and then just clearing the whole field late on and then just getting probably grass and vegetation regrowth. We've nearly always got flowers in that field, so we're inclined to leave it like that for as long as we can, and it therefore becomes more of an issue of thinking, because we actually also take them out very early on, first week of January, because I didn't mention, but one of the things I'm trying to also get going in that upper field of crocus now. We got lots from scattering seed, not planting crocus corms, and we got lots of seedling crocus now, but we have to take the sheep out first week of January if you want to do that. So you know, it's those sort of questions you have to, if you're doing it this way, that you have to kind of think about those really and work out a strategy. So I don't know whether that's been helpful.
Yeah. Next one, Sarah.
Next one from Sarah is, have you had reeds appearing in the wildflower meadow, and if so, how do you stop them taking over spreading? Okay, Sarah, I haven't really featured, but we have I've featured the upper sloping meadow. We have valley bottom meadows as well, and we had a huge issue there with when you say reeds, I'm guessing you mean rushes, soft rushes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a huge issue there, and I've done a whole separate film talk on how we manage that. So
we haven't really had them in the top meadow.
We haven't really had them in the top meadow, and
okay.
So I don't know whether I mean, it might be of interest to look at the film I made about how we manage them in the bottom of the field, but it's a whole big topic really. So
Okay, is that on the Carmarthenshire Meadows website?
No.
The film that you made about the reeds.
Sorry, have I?
Is
what?
It on the Carmarthenshire
No,
Meadows
it
website?
isn't. It's. I mean, I've done it as a kind of a DVD, and I mean, it was done quite a long time ago when our internet wouldn't allow us to put YouTubes or anything like that up. I mean, it's possible if there was interest that it could. I guess it could go online now.
Yeah, I mean, I also wondered, is there anything wrong with the reeds spreading? Because do they provide a habitat for, so the whole habitat in themselves?
Well, I think the big issue, well, it depends what you want, of course. Our experience was with our wet meadows that they were becoming 90% monoculture soft rush, because over time they are just such a dominant species, and interestingly they're one of the few plants, but I didn't know this at the time, but they're one of the few plant species that doesn't require interaction with mycorrhizal fungi. And our bottom fields now are, having gone through this process, are pretty much soft rush free. We have other rushes, we have sharp flowered rush, but they just don't create the dominant issues that soft rush do. And interestingly, although our bottom fields are completely flat, I mean, there's a stream running down the valley. If you have a look on the website, you'll probably find some images of it. So it's not terribly good drainage. Now our neighbour on the other side of the stream has a sloping field into which, in our 25 years here, we've seen he's put in proper land drainage, but his field is kind of permanently grazed with cattle and sheep from April through to November, and he put slurry onto it. When we came here, there were no soft rush in that field, and now it's almost completely dominated by soft rust.
Mm.
So what you know, from the point of view of the topography, really, you would expect his field to be much better than our valley bottom ones, but I do think it comes down to this kind of management issue. But you know, he's commercial farming, and we're not commercial farming. We kind of we're tinkering. We're hobby farmers, but we have maybe another slant on things. So.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Have you got?
George was snake.
I don't know how to write it down there. Have you got celandines,
Yes.
Yes.
Julian?
Yes, we have, and I don't know. There are certain bits of the garden where there are certain bits of the garden where we have some more choice spring flowers, actually, like the Primula Seboldii, I say, where I do. I mean, I know you're never going to win with celandines, but and I think if they become very dense, then they can really outcompete crocus and I think Primula Seboldii. So there are areas where I will fork them out when they're in flower. But after it's been a dreadfully cold spring up here, and they were some of the first flowers to open and get after the really cold weather. And you know, they're great nectar and pollen sources for honeybees particularly. So in the terrace garden, we actually leave them, and you're never quite sure with something like that, you know, how's that going to work out? But I'm sufficiently confident after all this time, I think, that and of course they go, don't they? So it's really, they're only going to outcompete the other spring flowering, less vigorous or less tall plants, I suppose. So yeah, we don't really we do it piecemeal, I suppose, in certain bits of the garden.
Thank you.
So what do you do with your celandine, Ros and Loz?
Give in, I think, is the word. They seem to multiply every year, and also one of the members in the garden club. Well, we thought we had Lynn and Adrian. We went and saw them, and their celandines are about 3 times as big as ours. So we're so worried then. But I just wondered if you know, we've just learned to accept them, and like you say, they do go away eventually, and they are very pretty, but they seem to be everywhere this year more than ever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're huge.
But they
And
are,
also-
you know, I think it's like a lot of these things, isn't it? Dandelions. You know, in the meadows, in the garden, we try and get the dandelions out, but maybe we're gradually winning. But in the meadows, I'm really encouraging dandelions because, I mean, I found a couple of new mining bees just the last week that are out there collecting pollen from and I guess nectar from the dandelions, and they really, you know, our flora, Britain's flora is pretty poor, isn't it, because of the last ice age. So we don't have a lot of this early flowering stuff. And so in a year like this, I think our native insects have had quite a battle, really. And things like dandelions and celandines probably help a great deal because they're the only things out there.
We've noticed this year the primroses and sort of primulas and associated things have been absolutely the best they've been since we've been here.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And primroses again. I mean, as you know, I spent years looking at these things, but for a long time I couldn't see what was pollinating primroses because I would never see insects on them. But actually this year, I've seen both honeybees and bumblebees. I mean, later on, from now on, it's mainly bee flies, you know, the little parasitic bee, well, parasites of mining bees, bee flies, which are spectacular insects that visit the primroses. But earlier on, I was seeing bumblebees and honeybees visiting, which I've never really seen before. But we got a lot more primroses, and maybe there's not been so much in the way of other flowers. Well, I don't think it has, because things like, I don't know what it's like near you, but up here all the gorse. We usually have masses of gorse, and that's just all been blitzed by the cold and the wind this year.
Ours hasn't actually, and it has been cold here, and we're still getting night frosts every night.
Yeah,
But the gorse is absolutely fantastic.
yeah. Well, yeah, we were down near you the last week, and we thought that it was looking, but no, up here it's just gone, which we've never seen before. Even our red Russian kale in the veg garden, which we usually keep for early sprouting, and then it flowers, which is a great plant. I mean, that's just gone. You know, never mind the hungry gap. It's just completely wiped out.
Well, I must admit, we don't have as many bumblebees this year as we've had in previous years. They seem to be a lot less. I think that again is the cold winds that's done for them, perhaps, and these exceptional night frosts.
The variation from hot days.
The cold nights, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's been about 12 days of frost in the last 15 nights.
Yeah.
Last night was the first night we didn't have.
Yeah.
We shortly got to go down and put the fleece on because it's going to be frosty again tonight.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you for brilliant talk, Julian. We're really looking forward to when we can actually get back to seeing everybody in person. But
Yes.
this is really the next best thing.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
It's really excellent. Thank you so much.
Well, no, well, thank you for tuning in.
Okay, any other questions?
Oh,
Rowena.
yeah, Rowena.
Rowena.
No, I'm just saying goodbye.
Oh, you saying goodbye? Okay.
Bye-bye.
And love celandine.
Love Cellulose, yeah.
That's what you should do with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the right place.
Yeah.
Which is every place in our planet.
Yeah. I've got two varieties now going. Very heart-shaped with mottled leaves, and then the other boisterous one. The other boisterous one, handfuls of them have been removed, I'm afraid. Okay, yes, I think that's it. Julian, thank you very much with your great support from Fiona, and fingers worked really well in keeping your internet going.
Yeah, well, it was all down to the Hercules.
Excellent.
Yeah. And a reminder, anyone who wants to join us for Stephen Anderton, send me an email so that I can add you to the list.
Great.
Okay. So thanks again, and bye. See
Thank
everybody.
you very much,
Okay, thank you
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Let's talk.